Wonderful, and we should be live now. Right. Welcome to the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast Live, and I have here Mike Mroczka. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly.
You did. You did.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, Mike, I'm very excited about this interview, and I'm going to introduce you real quick to our viewers and listeners here. So, Mike is a former software engineer who has worked with Google and Salesforce as well as GE. He's now a tech consultant with a decade of experience helping engineers land their dream jobs. He's a top-rated mentor and the author of viral technical content on system design and technical interview strategies, and also one of the co-authors of the book here, Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview, which is a very heavy book, and it has a lot of great advice. Because me not being a software developer, I read most of it, like passing through. I'm like, oh, there's such good information. So, and we're going to talk a lot about it today. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk a little bit about interviews and how hard they can be these days.
Yes, and particularly the evolutions now in the age of AI, which we'll talk about that absolutely today. So, Mike, I want to know, how did you enter into working for such big companies as Google and Salesforce, and then that transition into becoming a coach or an interview, helping people do better interviews as well?
Yeah, I have a fun story there because I think that most people, like you'd think, have been coding since they were 5 or something like that, and I actually didn't write my first line of code until I was about 20. And I was 3.5 years into a 4-year degree for physical therapy, and then I saw the Iron Man movies that came out, those Marvel movies, and I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to learn that. And so I totally did a 180, pivoted, and kind of went through schooling to do that. And I figured, hey, if I'm going to do this, I might as well do it right. I want to join one of the big tech companies that are known for their software engineers. And so Google was a natural fit. And I looked into what's the process. And it turns out these coding interviews, even 10 years ago, were very, very challenging to kind of pass. So I started practicing, and then I became kind of the person in the group of people that were like in my group of friends that like knew how to do kind of interview stuff. And then just from there, it took off into coaching and mentoring and just kind of working through stuff. And there's thousands of questions that you can go through on question sites, and I'm embarrassed to admit that I've done most of them. So it's a lot of fun to kind of do, and that's kind of how I got from there to here.
That's amazing. And you kind of from entering into becoming a software engineer and just like right into going into these big companies like Google, and the fact that that's the dream job for a lot of software engineers that I know. And so now, knowing that the fact that you know specifically very well the field in terms of the interview field, could you explain a little bit in terms of what does the technical interview entails? What is a technical interview, in case there are folks that may not be familiar with those concepts?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because it used to be not well known even by software engineers. It used to be you'd go into Google and you wouldn't know what you were going to expect in the interview, and they could ask you anything. They could ask you brain teasers. There's if you were shrunk down to the size of a small fly and put in a blender, what would you do? And like apparently there's a right answer to that question. And they used to ask things like that. Nowadays it's more standard. They actually ask you to do a simple task, or even sometimes a complicated task in code live in front of them. So like you're sharing your screen, or there's some sort of shared editor to kind of go through it. And that's kind of one way of doing things. Those are coding interviews, and that's kind of what the book focuses on. There are certainly still behavioral interviews, and behavioral interviews matter even if you're technical. Like being able to communicate is super important. It's one of the things you can't fake well with AI quite yet. And then there's also sort of system design interviews where it's like, it's not quite coding, it's not quite behavioral, it's somewhere in between about how you would design things. So that's kind of what the range of things tend to be.
Interesting. And let's start, because I want to walk through a little deeper into each step of the part of the interview. But even before that, right now in this market that is so competitive, what are some recommendations for people to just get their foot on the door in terms of contacting recruiters, resumes? What advice do you have there?
Yeah, so I've got a controversial opinion on this. So I'm not saying it's 100% right, but it's sort of what I've found to be true for me and a large body of clients I've worked with. What I'd say is nowadays there are AI tools that let you, for one job, like sort of fill in your profile and give it your resume, and then it'll go and it'll apply to 10,000 jobs for you. And there are tools that'll do this. And that means every single role now has 10, 20, 30 times more applicants, which makes it hard for recruiters to actually screen candidates effectively. And recruiters already have been overwhelmed with the number of amounts of work that they've tried to sort of kind of manage. So what I found tends to be best for people that are interested in getting their foot in the door, especially at certain companies, is to look at the people that are actively hiring. And you can go to LinkedIn. There are ways to sort of, there are tools that kind of help you navigate this process. But if you find a hiring manager that's actively looking for back-end engineers at DoorDash, for instance, I just saw a post this morning. There's a back-end engineer like hiring manager, or there's a hiring manager looking for back-end engineers. If you message that person directly, that's going to really up your chances of getting in. Not only you do that on LinkedIn, but also you can even find ways to like guess at what their email is going to be, because usually their first name plus whatever the last name or plus the company website. So Mike Mroczka at google.com, for instance, that's, so it's a good way to kind of guess what the email will be. And then from there, you send them a personal email and you say, this is who I am. I'm very interested in you specifically. It's not AI generated. It's clearly thoughtful. And that's a great way to kind of just get your foot in the door and sort of pass that initial recruiter screen.
Yeah, I actually share your opinion. It could be controversial for some in terms of people believing you have to follow the process. But in these days, with such, as you say, that it's very competitive and it's a matter of sometimes who you know. So if you don't know anybody, to get you your foot in the door, definitely doing that introduction. I agree with that approach. And how is a good way to, you mentioned in terms of making it thoughtful, are there any specific feedback for that initial communication that we should do with when we're interested with the hiring manager to kind of distinguish ourselves for that?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think there are some things you can do to just make their lives a little bit easier. So sometimes people forget to send the resume, but you want to kind of like, lead with like everything that you kind of can. So let them know who you are up front. If you have a website linking to that, that can be super awesome. Just a quick way to have a little bit about you. And then don't make it all about you though. So start off with like, hey, I think your work is cool. This is why I'm interested in this specific company. So again, if you were interested in DoorDash, you'd say, hey, I've seen some of the technology that you've built and some of the system design work that you've done has been particularly fascinating. This is an article that really appealed to me. I'm really interested in working in this space. Do you have kind of any advice? And you can kind of go from there. You can certainly link your resume and stuff like that, but not making it all about you and what you want tends to go a long way there. I would also say that a lot of people spend a lot of their time on their resume, thinking that the resume is sort of the main thing. And resumes are certainly helpful. And in some industries, they're certainly one of the main ways to screen. But for software engineering specifically, I think people spend hours and hours tweaking their resume, trying to add the right keywords and things like that. Whereas, like, again, if you can almost skip most of this process if you just go out and kind of directly contact the hiring manager. I find if you ask 10 different people to review your resume, all of which claim to be experts in like resume tweaking, they'll all give different advice as to what your resume should look like, which means to a certain extent, it's all kind of subjective anyways. Not that there's no advice to having somebody look through your resume, but there's only so much you can do before you need to just kind of get in front of somebody and talk to them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Love that advice. The terms of going in, connecting, and communicating effectively. Now, let's say you got the hiring manager, now you got your foot in the door. How can we prepare? How can software engineers start preparing properly for interviews? What are some good steps? And I know in the book you describe a lot of that. So, what are some good steps to do that?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. You can see it's a very thick book. There's a lot of information there. But what I'd say, the high level thing to realize is that most software engineers, most technical roles now, are ones that you need to prepare for, because the role itself is going to be different than the interview. Most people think if you're a good engineer, you should just be able to pass interviews. That's actually not the way it works. The interviews have very little to do with what your day-to-day job ends up being. So being able to practice that is important. And that's something that companies encourage. You'll actually see companies like Google and Meta in their initial email reach out to you. They'll say, hey, here's some resources. Please take some time to go through it, because it's important to know what the process is going to be like. So realizing that this is a game where, like, if you spend time on it, you're much more likely to improve your odds. As a lot of people kind of resist that because they don't want to spend the time on it. So just realizing that this is a bit of a process that will take time, and that you can kind of gamify the system if you, sort of do your best to sort of focus on that initial prep.
And you talk in the book a lot about the part of the they don't necessarily assess the correct answers. It's more like how you address problem solving. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So everyone thinks that they need to solve the problem optimally, and I will say that there is some truth to that. Certainly, if you don't do anything well in the interview, it's hard to kind of give you a good grade. So you can't just get by on personality alone. But I do think that there's a little bit of an over optimization on just the technology pieces and not enough of the communication. So if you can't talk, if you can't introduce yourself well, if you are constantly like writing things and then unwriting it, or like even if you're just not being clear with the interviewer, you're going to sort of lose points. Points is, I don't love to use the word points, but like let's assume that they're points in an interview. You're going to kind of lose points if you're not being able to communicate exactly what it is you're thinking. So that's kind of a maybe a meta point, if that helps.
Yeah, I love it because it's addressing specifically like the soft skills, quote unquote, in terms of
Yes,
like that are needed. Like if
exactly.
you have the knowledge, yeah, well, how to communicate clearly, that's key. Do they, is it usually in interviews that is evaluated like the problem solving approach, like if you have a framework for problem solving, or is that something that's evaluated as well?
Yeah, so usually every tech company cares about sort of five things, and they might weight them differently, but they care about five things. You might say only four, but I'm going to include a fifth. So the first one, sort of your communication ability. The second one is just, can you actually code? What does your code look like? The third is problem solving. So were you able to figure out what the right answer was to the question? And that's actually non-trivial. That's where a lot of the practice kind of comes in. And then the fourth one is verifying. So you've figured out the problem, you've coded it up. Can you verify that your solution does what you say it does? Often you'll code one thing and then it actually ends up doing something different than what you anticipated. And then the final one is speed. And I'd say that not every company cares about speed, but enough of them care about it. Meta is a good example where they actually ask 2 questions in a single interview. So if you have 4 interviews, you're going to do 8 different questions. That's actually quite a lot. Just, you're mentally exhausted by the end of it, after you've kind of done a full day's worth of interviews, because they just expect back-to-back answers, and speed sometimes can matter as well.
Wow. And in terms of the part of the behavioral aspect of the interview, so that usually takes place in the same interview, or is that a separate interview that happens?
There's usually a little bit of behavioral at the beginning, there your
Mhm.
intro, and then to a certain extent your outro as well. What we do is we call it time time, basically tell me about yourself. And it's like
Okay.
being able to talk about yourself for a minute and a half to 2 minutes without rambling, being able to talk a little bit about your technical experience, maybe mention if you have a dog or not, or something like that. Kind of be a human, and being able to do that is certainly important. And then there's also usually a dedicated behavioral piece to the whole interview process overall, and that's a separate interview where they ask you all the traditional kind of questions, like how do you deal with conflict, what happens when you're put on a project you don't like all those sorts of kind of questions that you have to answer.
Wow, love it. So again, just love the fact that it's addressing the essential skills too, and so it's important perhaps to have prepare like a short elevator speech, like knowing like to answer just that question, tell us about yourself. It's very easy to go ramble about so in terms of describing experience, background, back in the day, etc. So and the part of the resolving conflict that you mentioned, and what other skills or what other non-technical things do you think are important to interviewers and that the candidates should be able to practice?
Yeah, we lump it all under communication, but communication is actually several different things. Part of it's being able to actively listen, show that you're engaged in the conversation. Part of it's being able to describe things and describe your ideas in a way that makes sense and is somewhat articulate. I'm always nervous when I talk about the importance of communication that I'm going to say something really dumb while communicating to you the importance of communication. But I do think that at the end of the day, really it involves all of the active listening skills that anyone for any job is going to need to kind of be involved in. The more specific things for software engineers that are worth noting is half of our job is coding, but the other half is listening to other people and hearing what they want us to code and translating their thoughts into code, which means being able to say, okay, this is what I'm hearing you say you want. I think that means it would look like this. And then technically, this is how I would accomplish that. So it's being able to not just communicate, but being able to communicate technical ideas in an easy sort of manner, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great in terms of being able to. Uh, you described there a very effective technique of listening in terms of repeating back to the person what you thought you heard to make sure that there's a common share understanding there.
Exactly.
And you've mentioned showing the human part. Now, let's talk about AI and let's talk about the state of how interviews have changed due to AI. What has been some of the significant changes you have seen?
Yeah, it's run the gambit. We think sort of pre-pandemic, interviews were mostly in person, and then the pandemic happened, and all of a sudden, most interviews are online for a while. And lots of companies liked the cost savings of that and kept interviews online. I'd say most technical interviews now at least have mostly an online piece, and then potentially some interview or in-person pieces. What's interesting for software engineers specifically, it depends on what types of news that you read, but perhaps folks have seen in the news that there are lots of tools that now exist for you to cheat in technical interviews. And there are AI tools that'll listen in on the conversation, understand the question, and then will type out an answer for you. And it's really crazy, the kind of cool technologies that exist. And it is cool, like it's very cool tech. But at the end of the day, like you do actually need to know how to do the job if you want to kind of keep the job, so to speak. So the AI pieces of it are really sort of twofold. There's sort of all of the tools that help you apply faster. And in some ways, that's changed the interview process because now directly applying doesn't mean as much as it once did. And then when you're doing interviews, the ability to just bang out an answer to a question matters less. It's like, can you explain your answer? So nowadays, not only do you need to write the code, but you need to also then be able to have them point to a specific line of code. And then you need to be able to articulate what that does and why it's necessary. So it's now not
Mhm.
just about getting the right answer, but showing that you understand why it was. So like, sure, the AI maybe wrote it for you, but if it's a complicated line of code, you're not going to be able to explain it unless you actually know what's going on.
That's interesting. So, knowing, being able to explain through the process, because yeah, I presume that you could make your life easier using AI, but
Absolutely.
also the knowing the why behind the use of a specific code
Yes.
will be very helpful. Now, are there things that cannot be faked by AI just yet?
Yeah, I love this question. There's sort of the human piece. I'd say it's pretty difficult to fake behavioral interviews, especially at big tech companies, because they have a very specific structure that they kind of expect. So Amazon's well known for what's called their leadership principles interview, and they have specific sets of questions that they are looking for answers on, where it's like they care about you being obsessed with customers, and like customer obsession is what they call it. Or deliver and like basically just a bunch of values that you have to sort of show that you care about. So being able to map real world experiences that you have to those values requires initial effort, and I think this is where preparation really kind of matters and helps you shine. But this isn't something an AI can do on the fly. So being able to sort of map your actual experience to answers is one of those pieces. The other piece actually is I think that when it comes to in-person interviews, there's a huge advantage to this. There's companies again like Amazon and Meta, I think, are currently moving back to at least some amount of in-person interviews because you have some amount of personality through a remote interview. Like certainly you and I have some personality as we're going back and forth between this, but you really don't know a whole lot about me yet. But if you spend 45 minutes with me in person, like it actually tells you, it gives you more information. So yeah, a lot of that kind of things is the stuff that AI still can't quite it can't be faked.
Yeah, no, that's great. The human aspect of the showing the values, the caring about the customer. Now, you mentioned in terms of preparation. So, how far in advance do we need to prepare for interviews? What's a good time frame? What resources should candidates look for when it comes to preparing for the technical aspect of the interview?
Yeah, this is always a hard thing to answer because it really depends on where you're currently at in the process. So certainly somebody that's sort of a junior engineer that doesn't have a lot of experience with interviews is going to need more prep than somebody that's a senior engineer. And we find sometimes actually the reverse is true. Maybe the junior engineer it knows the questions are coming because they're looking like, to get a job at some point, but somebody with 10 years of experience thinks they don't need it anymore because they're already a good engineer and it doesn't matter. So realizing that no matter who you are, like there's some amount of work that's going to need to be put into it. We've seen crazy stats. We've seen one guy that quit his job to study for a year to then try and
Uh,
get a job in a tech company. I'd say that's overkill. That's definitely not what you need to do. Most people kind of do, like if you're working kind of part time, you can get really, really solid at this sort of thing within 2 to 3 months of sort of consistent practice on the side. for a few hours every single day. Now, I find that if you really want to kind of cram that, you could do it in 3, 4, 5 weeks. But realistically speaking, it depends on how much you're struggling with the questions versus how much you're struggling with the interviewing, because they're not the same skill. One thing is, can you code well and solve problems? The other is, can you communicate effectively technical concepts in an interview? So the skill of interviewing is a skill that needs to be practiced. And it's one that I think engineers fall into that stereotype of not being very good at.
No, that's wonderful. So preparing, I guess, a lot of preparation in terms of not just the material, but also like the ability to interact, answer the questions too. Now, we've talked about assuming that interviews are like the interviewing is great, that they have a sound process for interviews. But how do we as candidates detect that there's a bad interview or a bad interviewer? How do we detect that, or in terms of us as candidates?
Sure. Just to make sure I understand the question, is the question, how do companies know if somebody is sort of cheating in an interview, or am I misunderstanding the question?
No, actually, from the perspective of the candidate, if I
Oh, it is
have
from the candidate.
a bad interviewer that's asking
Uh,
me questions, like, is there a way to detect that?
yeah. So, well, it's interesting what you mean by a bad question. So, I mean, I think there are
Mhm.
some questions that are just like not fun questions to answer. And certainly there
Yeah.
are such things as bad questions. But what I'd say is most companies at most interviewers at major tech companies have a series of questions that they pull from a database somewhere, an internal database that's sort of embedded. So usually questions that are bad aren't usually common. I think what's more common is actually that you have a bad interviewer. And there
Mhm.
are some interviewers that actually just don't care. So I've seen everything from interviewers show up 20 minutes late to a 30-minute interview and then only give the candidate 10 minutes of time, to people that put themselves on mute and clearly aren't there anymore and like have left their desk or something like that while the candidate's talking. So those things are kind of red flags. And what I'd say the best thing for you to do if you find yourself in that situation, it doesn't happen super often, but if you find yourself in that situation, kind of just like letting your recruiter know, hey, I'm pretty sure the interviewer left the call. Like that's an important thing to be able to say. And usually they're pretty good at actually giving you a second chance there. They understand that their interviewers, like, they're not always malicious either. We say a bad interviewer, but sometimes, like, they're swamped at work, or they get called into an urgent meeting or something like that. And it's, it's not a good excuse. It's still a waste of people's time, but it does unfortunately happen.
Yeah, yeah. I guess having some, as you say, the empathy aspect of understanding there could be things happening in the background that we don't know about.
Yes.
And I want to ask you another question as well in terms of, and before the interview, we were talking a little bit about that was for folks that are trying to like in the mid-career, just trying to shift careers, getting into software engineer and just getting their foot in the door. Like my sister, for example, she's very enthusiastic about coding, although her education had nothing to do with that. So what do you recommend for folks who are just starting to get into it? Do they need to get a degree, and how do they ensure that they prepare properly to enter into the field?
Such a great question. Yeah, I think some of the best coders I know actually used to be, physicists, soccer
Mhm.
players, biology majors. So it's like you can come from all aspects of life and kind of come into it. The industry, we don't care, we don't discriminate. And honestly, titles don't mean a whole lot in the industry. We care an awful lot more about what you can actually do. So if your sister, for instance, was interested in kind of getting into it, the first thing to do is just kind of learn the basics of coding. And there's lots of ways to do that. There are coding boot camps you can do, some of which are even free to attend. And finding kind of a way to just kind of make sure it's your thing. You can spend somewhere between, sort of 2 weeks to 12 weeks just sort of learning a bit about how to code. You're not going to learn everything, and there's still going to be plenty more to learn. But in somewhere between, like, let's say maybe let's say a month to 2 to 3 months, you can get a really good sense as to whether or not this is what you want to do. And what I find is most people that take the plunge don't look back. They really do enjoy it because coding is a lot of fun. It's personally very satisfying. And if you do kind of decide that it's for you from there, past a boot camp stage is kind of to figure out what exactly you want to do. So it's very different if you're going to be working on, like, I've got a set of AirPods here. If you want to be working on how the the logic of AirPods work, that's going to be very different than if you want to build a website. So kind of figuring out like what general areas do you care about? Do you want to work on self-driving cars? Do you care about working on, microcontrollers? It really kind of all depends. And then once you kind of figured that out, the next kind of big thing to do is to now talk about like, how do we kind of get qualifications that matter there? And that has very little to do with certifications. It has very little to do with a degree, and it has a lot more to do with finding projects that you can work on. And there are open source ways to kind of give back to projects and start coding immediately that you could kind of immediately start contributing to. And then those sorts of things will lead to jobs. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification of what's a fairly complex process, but that's maybe the high level answer to that question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for that advice. And since you deal a lot with candidates and their experiences, do you have any story to share about good or bad interviews that you have either witnessed or any person that works with you have shared with you?
Yeah, I think some of the most egregious interviews have always been the interviewer, not the interviewee. I find the interviewees tend to really care because they're not going to interview if they don't care. It's usually the interviewer that's the problem. So there are some interesting stories. Again, I've heard stories of interviewers literally leaving the interview. There was one from COVID a while ago where my friend was on the call doing the interview, so he was the interviewee, not the interviewer. And his interviewer didn't realize they were on camera, and they started undressing.
Oh my
It was
God.
like a whole thing. So it's like there certainly are plenty of different things in the process, and I don't think there was anything malicious there. It was clearly just off camera, and they thought they were going to change their pants, but it was an ordeal. So yeah, like I think the processes are kind of funny, but I do think that besides the interviewer on the interviewee side, I think the biggest thing we end up seeing is what interviewees do after the interview. So we've seen some people go to great lengths to try and get a job at Google, for instance. So there's classic examples of, there's one person quite a long time ago that got one of those big exercise balls, ones that are like, 3 foot wide, and they just wanted to get noticed. And so what they did is they took a resume and they affixed it to this big giant bouncy ball, and then sent the whole bouncy ball, this huge package, to Google, and just arrived. And everybody's like, what's this? Who is it from? And so they opened it up, and it's this person that just wanted to get noticed. And so interviewees go to crazy lengths to kind of do that. And that's kind of fun. It's like being able to stand out. I've seen some people build entire like websites to like a little mock, what was it? Like a little like sprite where you can move around the person around, and like you can see different things about, oh, this person, you go to this corner of the room and it's a little bit about their resume, and you go to this corner of the room, it's a little bit more about their resume. So people go to great lengths to try and get into big tech companies, but it's usually all positive things on that side of things that I end up seeing.
That's wonderful. So just to get it straight, so did it work for that person? Is that something you recommend in terms of going to the great lengths to do that?
With AI being able to apply to 1,000 jobs in a couple of minutes these days, like anything you can do to stand out makes a huge difference. I'm not necessarily sure the bouncy ball idea is going to work now that somebody's already done it, but something equally crazy most assuredly will get you noticed. Just make sure that you've kind of towed that line between being crazy and being, just being, like just creative. So just be careful.
Not too crazy, I guess. Not risky anyway. That's great. Now, that part of, let's say, the interview is done. So what are good ways to either do we do follow-ups? What are some good ways to kind of make sure that we are actually leaving with a good impression?
Yeah. So a lot of people think thank you notes are a good idea, and I don't think that they're a bad idea. I just don't think I don't think they're going to sway the process one way or the other. They're a nice sentiment for sure, but they're not going to really affect the process very much. The thing that can make a big difference, though, is that especially in these big tech companies, it's really easy for things to go well, for the interviews to have gone well, and then somehow you were dropped in the process, and it's not you, it's actually just something in the company. Unfortunately, recruiters have a very high turnover rate, for instance, and it's possible that maybe you were going to get an offer, but then the recruiter, got let go or something like that, and you get dropped in the process. So being able to kind of communicate and sort of follow up and say, hey, I thought I did well in this, and like, what's kind of going on? Where are we at in the process? Seeing, does that email bounce? Is it possible that it's not valid anymore? And do we need to contact somebody else at the company? I think so many people think if they don't hear back, it's a rejection, and that's often not the case, especially at these big tech companies where there's just huge moving process parts and lots of processes and all that kind of stuff. So following up after, usually we say about after 1 to 2 weeks is usually a great kind of next step.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for all the advice that you have given us today, Mike. And also, I highly recommend the book as well because it has a lot of great detailed information and material to study for candidates to prepare. Now, what are the best ways for people to get in touch with you, and if they have questions for you as well?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think at this point, you definitely can find me on LinkedIn. My name's Mike Mroczka, but hard to spell. So we also maybe we'll leave it in the show notes as
Yeah,
well. And then my website's actually my name as well, Mike Mroczka. So if anyone's interested in any sort of coaching or interview coaching or stuff like that, I also do that on the side.
yeah, and you mentioned that there's additional updates for the book in terms of items that may, with the evolution of AI and all this, the changing landscape of interviews. Do you have material that you're working on?
Yeah, so at the moment, there are some new things in the pipeline. But before I forget, I actually just wanted to say that there are some free chapters that we're kind of giving away for the book as well for the readers. So if you want to check the show notes there, it's just the link says free chapters on it. So definitely take a look at that. But I'm definitely going to forget to say it if I don't say it now. As far as kind of next steps go, I also do kind of consulting for companies on how to sort of plug the gaps for coding interviews. Right now, again, we have this cheating process that kind of happens fairly regularly, and companies want to know how to stop it. So I do consulting work on how to prevent AI-based cheating and things like that, and that's a fun use of my time. Again, if you go to my website, you can kind of see information on that as well.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much again, Mike, and this has been a great interview. So it's a great. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge.
I appreciate your time.